Hey friends, tonight we're diving headfirst into the velvet-draped chaos of royal bedrooms, secret corridors, and scandal-soaked thrones, where kings ruled not just with scepters, but with egos, appetites, and a complete disregard for boundaries. From queens locked away and lovers made into diplomats, to mistresses with more power than ministers, this isn't the history they teach in school. It's the one they tried to bury behind stained glass and marble statues. So before we step into the madness, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if this kind of unapologetically real history is your thing. Now dim the lights, pour yourself something vaguely royal, and let's begin our descent into the most scandalous chapters medieval Europe ever tried to forget. Under the candlelit stone halls of medieval courts, the idea of a noble ruler, wise, restrained, and divinely guided, was less a reality and more a flattering myth told to make chaos look like order. Behind polished heraldry and well-scripted proclamations, some kings behaved not like leaders of nations, but like men possessed, not by duty or faith, but by something far more primal: the intoxicating certainty that no one could stop them. This was not governance. This was theater, with blood and desire as the main plot. And at the center of this twisted stage stood one man who made tyranny feel like a personal hobby: John Lackland, King of England. He is remembered in school books for signing the Magna Carta, that ancient document heralded as the foundation of rights and limits to royal power. But those pages, so revered today, weren't born from enlightenment. They were a desperate leash snapped on a monarch who treated self-restraint as a foreign language. John's reign wasn't just turbulent, it was almost cinematic in its dysfunction. While half of France slipped from his fingers and noble rebellions simmered like kettle pots, John poured his energy into a pastime that had little to do with ruling and everything to do with domination. He didn't court noble women, he captured them. He didn't persuade loyalty, he manipulated intimacy. Royal castles became more than fortresses. They were gilded traps where daughters of powerful men vanished behind doors, only to re-emerge changed, silenced, or sometimes not at all. His relationships weren't secret affairs whispered behind fans. They were deliberate moves in a dangerous game where affection, shame, and strategy danced together like guests at a funeral masquerade. What made John truly unsettling wasn't just the frequency of these encounters, it was their precision. He didn't need swords to break alliances. He needed charm, cruelty, and the ability to make a husband watch his household unravel. Seduce the wife, humiliate the lord, and then double his taxes as a finishing touch. It was efficient, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. He dismantled power structures, not with war, but with whispered promises and unwanted visits. There was no general to fight, no battlefield to charge, just fear festering quietly in every noble household. Chroniclers of the time, who usually turned a blind eye to torture, floggings, and wars waged for petty pride, couldn't ignore John's behavior. Even those loyal to the crown were forced into euphemisms, not temperate with women, they wrote, a phrase that tried and failed to make predation sound polite. In medieval ink, that was the equivalent of ringing a church bell during a silent fast, and the kingdom heard. At one point, John's official list of mistresses reportedly numbered in the dozens. That wasn't a record. That was a logistical nightmare. And it didn't stop with noble ladies. Serving maids, his distant relatives, political hostages, anyone within reach was fair game. Hospitality wasn't honored, it was exploited. During royal visits, entire families would lock their doors, not out of formality, but out of sheer panic. One baron famously refused to meet John face to face unless his wife, daughters, and all female staff were secured elsewhere. That wasn't diplomacy, that was survival. But perhaps the most chilling part of John's legacy is that none of this was hidden. There was no attempt at denial, no half-hearted public repentance. John believed, truly believed, that he was irresistible, that his charm, rank, and title rendered resistance irrelevant. And why wouldn't he? Who, after all, would stop the king? Laws were ink on parchment, morals were for priests, and John was his own confessor. He wasn't entirely delusional. In a world where power flowed from lineage and land, his position gave him a kind of twisted immunity. That illusion of invincibility fed the monster. Every door that opened without question, every silence held in a noble hall, only affirmed what he already knew deep down. He could do whatever he wanted, and he did, repeatedly, without pause, without shame. And in the end, it wasn't justice that caught up to him. It was history. A kingdom drained, trust shattered, whispers passed like disease in corridors where once there had been loyalty. His personal choices hadn't just stained his reputation. They eroded the foundation of monarchy itself. People didn't rise up because of taxes or treaties. They rose because they were tired of looking over their shoulders when the king came calling. John didn't invent the misuse of royal privilege, but he perfected it in a way that echoed for centuries. He left behind more than a broken realm. He left a blueprint of how absolute power, left unchecked, could rot not just the man who wielded it, but the very nation beneath him. This was no mere chapter in medieval gossip. This was the beginning of something much larger, the slow unraveling of sacred authority, thread by thread, under the weight of one man's appetites. And he was only the beginning. The royal court was meant to be a place of order, hierarchy, and divine wisdom. But in the hands of some kings, it became a strange theater where logic bent under the weight of delusion, and madness wasn't hidden. It was dressed in velvet, crowned with gold, and treated like royal eccentricity. Few monarchs embodied this paradox more completely than Charles VI of France, a man who began his reign as a golden boy and ended it believing he would shatter if touched. When Charles ascended the throne in 1380, he was young, brilliant, and radiant with promise. His rule seemed destined for glory, a king of charm and intellect, the kind who turned courtiers' heads not just with titles, but with talent. He was educated, athletic, and politically sharp. For a while, he even led successful military campaigns and held his court with grace. But slowly, a shadow crept into the corners of his mind, unnoticed at first, like a draft beneath a heavy door. It began with episodes, brief, unsettling lapses in memory, sudden rage, and moments when he stared into the distance as if watching something no one else could see. Advisors whispered, physicians guessed, but no one dared name it. The king was slipping into something deeper than melancholy. Then came the breaking point. One day, during a journey through a forest, Charles suddenly turned on his own knights, sword in hand, eyes wild, and struck out in a frenzy. When it was over, several men lay wounded or worse, and the king had to be subdued. He did not remember it, or chose not to. From that moment forward, Charles was no longer a ruler in control. He was a man unraveling in slow motion, each thread of sanity pulled loose, while the crown stayed fixed atop his head. And yet, the rituals of monarchy continued. Council meetings, state dinners, diplomatic ceremonies, all while the man at the center believed he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He was convinced that if touched, he would crack, splinter, and collapse into pieces. Servants were ordered to wrap him in thick layers of cloth, like a fragile artifact. Chairs were padded, movements choreographed. He sometimes refused to bathe, fearing that water might dissolve him. Mirrors were removed, for he could not bear to see himself, or feared what might look back. This wasn't just superstition. It was survival in the mind of a man whose reality had fractured. And yet, through all of this, the machinery of court life never stopped. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, took on the impossible role of both queen and caretaker. While Charles muttered about invisible threats and wandered palace halls in quilted armor meant to protect his imaginary fragility, she negotiated with nobles, mediated disputes, and held a crumbling realm together. She even endured whispers about her own loyalties, especially when another woman, Odette de Champdivers, was quietly brought into the palace and presented as the king's comfort. Odette, a noblewoman of considerable patience or ambition, became Charles's unofficial partner during his most chaotic years. She brushed his hair, listened to the same haunting refrains over and over, and dressed him layer by layer in padded garments so he could safely sit without believing he'd fracture. This wasn't love as sung in ballads. This was loyalty in the eye of a storm. Whether out of devotion or strategy, Odette stayed, navigating a relationship that defied reason yet defined her life. But Charles didn't limit his eccentricity to private quarters. He hosted elaborate court events that sometimes took a turn for the catastrophic. One such disaster, the infamous Bal des Ardents, was intended as a celebration but ended in horror. Charles and several of his friends, dressed as wild men, wearing costumes soaked in flammable pitch and hair. They danced with torches, laughed as the music played, and then someone dropped a flame. Fire spread. Screams echoed. Several died in front of the entire court. Charles survived, physically unscathed, but his dignity and mental state never fully recovered. He had turned entertainment into tragedy, and no one knew whether it was misfortune or a symptom of deeper collapse. Even in his most fragile years, Charles fathered children, 12 in total, some during lucid moments, others during periods where his awareness seemed more ghost than man. Chronicles do not say whether he remembered their names or attended their births, only that the bloodline continued as his mind faded. His reign stretched on, not because of his brilliance, but because no one could remove a king chosen by divine right, even when he couldn't tell the difference between reality and illusion. To the public, he remained a figurehead. To those within the palace, he was a daily reminder of how thin the line between majesty and madness could be. And to history, he became a tragic emblem of a kingdom led by a man who could not even trust his own body. In another world, Charles might have been remembered as a sensitive thinker, a poetic ruler with a fragile soul. But in the brutal calculus of medieval power, his softness became a liability, his mind a battlefield, and his reign a slow-motion disaster wrapped in silk. He wore the crown. He signed decrees. He sat on the throne encased in layers of fabric and fear. But the truth was undeniable. France was being led by a man who could not lead himself. And yet, no one dared to speak it aloud, because to admit the king was broken would be to admit that the system itself, divine right, noble blood, inherited rule, was also an illusion. So the court smiled, the kingdom trembled, and the king walked softly, hoping not to shatter. Love in the medieval courts was rarely tender. It was power wrapped in velvet, obsession hidden beneath oaths, and promises made not in whispered devotion, but behind bolted doors and drawn curtains. Nowhere was this blend of passion and peril more vividly embodied than in the life of Peter of Castile, known to some as Pedro the Just, and to others more accurately as Pedro the Cruel, a man who viewed romance as possession, marriage as manipulation, and betrayal as a pretext for elimination. His reign from 1350 to 1369 was less a chapter in royal history than a cautionary tale of what happens when a king believes love should obey him or vanish. Pedro didn't fall in love gently. He crashed into it violently. His first great infatuation was with Maria de Padilla, a noblewoman with a sharp mind and striking presence who captivated him entirely. Whether or not he married her in secret remains a mystery still debated by historians, but the intensity of his feelings for her shaped his rule from the very beginning. The problem? His heart wasn't the only thing involved. There were alliances to honor, treaties to fulfill, and dynasties to secure. So while Pedro clung to Maria, he was forced, politically, to wed another. Her name was Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman with royal blood and diplomatic significance. Their union was orchestrated for peace and legitimacy, but it lasted only 3 days. After that, Blanche was locked away in a castle, no trial, no explanation. Just a door closing behind her and the sound of Pedro's footsteps walking back toward Maria. Blanche would spend the rest of her life in confinement, a queen only on paper. To Pedro, she was little more than an interruption. Maria, meanwhile, was elevated to something more than mistress, yet never quite queen. She lived in the shadowed space between devotion and political invisibility, raising 4 of Pedro's children and ruling his heart with quiet authority. When she eventually passed, far too young, Pedro's grief was so intense it bordered on the theatrical. He ordered she be declared his lawful wife retroactively, forcing the court to accept a love story already buried. In his mind, if the law didn't support his passion, the law needed rewriting. But Pedro's obsession didn't end with Maria. It metastasized, transformed. What once was possessive affection twisted into something darker, a pattern of control, jealousy, and retribution. His relationships became weapons. Women who drew his eye were drawn close. Women who displeased him disappeared. Some were imprisoned, others silenced more permanently. Rumors swirled, and not just of heartbreak. One lover, Doña Juana de Castro, attempted to break ties with him. Days later, she was found lifeless, her fate whispered about in court halls, but never openly challenged. Pedro's methods were simple. Fall in love fast, trust no one, and if betrayal, real or imagined, entered the scene, remove the problem at its root. This wasn't romantic jealousy. It was strategy laced with madness. He viewed passion as loyalty and disloyalty as treason. Political opponents fared no better. Cousins vanished. Noblemen who dared question him found themselves watching executions from cells they once commanded. And sometimes Pedro watched too, lounging with a new companion as the executioner's blade fell, his eyes calm, his hand wrapped around a goblet, as if it were just another evening in the royal gardens. One ambassador described the Castilian court not as a place of governance, but of whispers and perfume-scented dread. Affairs were conducted with the same frequency as decrees, and the line between affection and punishment blurred until no one could tell whether Pedro's embrace was a reward or a prelude to exile. Even the architecture of his court reflected this contradiction. Palaces where silk-draped corridors ended in iron doors, and music played while political prisoners screamed behind stone walls. It all might have continued indefinitely. The nobles were terrified, but the kingdom remained under his grip until the fear turned inward. Pedro's own family, his half-brother Henry of Trastamara, rose against him. And this wasn't just rebellion. It was blood reckoning, brother against brother. Love turned vendetta. When the moment came, Pedro was captured, betrayed, and met his end not by revolution or foreign army, but by the same ruthless logic he had applied to others. His brother, perhaps acting out of justice, perhaps revenge, brought the final silence. Pedro's legacy is still debated. Some point to his efforts to centralize royal authority, others to his firm justice in civil law, but all that is overshadowed by his personal spiral. His reign teaches that passion, when left untethered in the hands of a king, does not become poetry. It becomes a blade. He loved fiercely, ruled cruelly, and saw no difference between the two. Where others signed treaties with ink, he did it with blood. Where others wed for peace, he married for obsession. And where others let go, he imprisoned, or worse. When a king chooses his heart over his crown, kingdoms tremble. In the case of Edward II of England, it wasn't simply a matter of bad governance. It was a monarchy consumed by personal passion. His reign, from 1307 to 1327, unfolded not as a tale of national leadership, but as a scandal-soaked romance played out on the stage of English politics. And in this theater, the king's favorites weren't advisors, they were obsessions. Men who stood not behind the throne, but beside it, sometimes ahead of it, and sometimes, dangerously, instead of it. The name Piers Gaveston echoes through history, not as a great statesman or military hero, but as the man who stole the king's attention, and, in the eyes of many, the kingdom itself. He and Edward were childhood companions, bonded early, deeply, and in a way that unsettled everyone around them. As Edward ascended the throne, he brought Piers back with him, showered him with titles, lands, and privileges that made even the most loyal nobles recoil. Piers wasn't subtle. He flaunted his influence, arriving at court events dressed in rich fabrics, adorned with jewels, and always standing just a little too close to the king. At Edward's coronation, while the queen stood solemn in her royal finery, Piers sparkled with a confidence that outshone the entire regalia. The whispers grew louder, rumors of a bond that exceeded friendship, of affections that had no place in public affairs, at least by the standards of medieval propriety. The nobility didn't just dislike Piers, they hated him. His presence mocked their traditions. His elevation bypassed their sons and their alliances. But Edward, blinded by loyalty or love, ignored their fury. Even when forced to exile Piers under pressure, Edward wept, sulked, and brought him back as soon as possible. It was less a political decision than a lover's stubborn reunion, and it signaled to the entire court that the king's desires were not just personal, they were policy. And then came Isabella. She was no naive bride. The daughter of Philip the First of France, Isabella arrived in England with political expectations and royal bloodline, but she quickly discovered she had not married a husband, but a man already spoken for. Her dowry bought her a crown, but not affection. The queen watched as her status eroded day by day. Each time Piers was granted another title, each time Edward ignored her at court, each time whispers filled the banquet hall. She smiled in public, but behind her eyes, the storm gathered. The nobles eventually reached their breaking point. Piers was captured and executed, not by foreign enemies, but by English lords who saw no other way to reclaim the throne from a man they viewed as a corrupting influence. Edward's reaction was volcanic. His grief was public, raw, and theatrical. He donned mourning clothes, withdrew from council, and made no attempt to hide his devastation. But where many expected reform, repentance, or even diplomacy, Edward found someone new. Hugh Despenser the Younger made Piers look discreet. Bold, calculating, and hungry for power, Hugh became not just Edward's confidant, but his shadow. Entire counties were handed over. Families were stripped of land and honor to satisfy Hugh's appetite for wealth. Together, Edward and Hugh ruled like a closed circuit, private decisions with public consequences. Nobles were exiled, opponents silenced. Justice became personal. And Isabella, she waited. If Piers was Edward's passion, Hugh was his mirror. Ruthless, confident, and deeply resented, he fed the king's isolation while inflaming the court's rebellion. Where once there had been gossip, now there was strategy. Where once Isabella had endured, now she planned. When the crown no longer offered her dignity, she sought power through other means, and found it in the most poetic of places, a man. Roger Mortimer, nobleman, rebel, and exiled enemy of the Despensers, became Isabella's partner in war, in strategy, and in life. Together they formed an alliance stronger than any marriage vow, and when they returned to England, it wasn't as emissaries, it was as executioners of an old order. The invasion was swift. Edward was cornered. The Despensers were dragged from their seats of power and met their end in brutal fashion, one hung, drawn, and publicly displayed, the other executed without mercy. Edward was stripped of his crown, his dignity, and finally his freedom. What happened next remains shrouded in legend. Some say he died in captivity, others that his final moments were marked by unspeakable punishment. But what is certain is this: his reign ended not with policy or reform, but with betrayal, the very force he had once ignored. Edward II's legacy is not one of laws or conquests. It is a story of personal devotion spiraling into political collapse. A king who placed his heart above his kingdom, and a queen who learned that patience could be a weapon. His court was not a government. It was a stage for obsession. His rule, not a chapter of English strength, but a medieval cautionary tale of how private passion, when unchecked, can consume a crown. There are kings who are remembered for their wisdom, their bravery in battle, or their architectural legacies. And then there are kings like Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, men whose reigns are not chronicled in triumphs or treaties, but in toasts, tantrums, and public indecency. If power can elevate a man to divine heights, it can just as easily reduce him to farce. And with Wenceslaus, the throne didn't just wobble under the weight of incompetence, it practically collapsed beneath a rolling keg. Crowned as King of Bohemia and King of the Romans, Wenceslaus started his reign with everything in his favor: a noble lineage, political promise, and an education that outshone many of his contemporaries. He spoke multiple languages, read philosophy, and was expected to continue the legacy of his powerful father, Charles III. But somewhere between the scrolls and the scepters, Wenceslaus chose a different path, one that meandered through wine cellars, backroom brawls, and questionable midnight declarations. He didn't rule from the throne so much as from the bottom of a goblet. Diplomacy became an afterthought, governing a distraction from the next party. Royal meetings blurred into drinking marathons that lasted for days, with policy discussions degenerating into slurred debates over mead and breadsticks. His advisors learned quickly: if you wanted a law passed, bring a bottle. If you wanted to survive a council session, bring two. Wenceslaus had an appetite for drink that outpaced even the most robust tavern regulars. But it wasn't just the drinking, it was the spectacle. He developed a fondness for hosting feasts where food flowed freely, clothes were optional, and formality was drowned in barrels of wine. At times, he would stand from his seat mid-banquet, remove his royal garments, and proclaim bold philosophical truths, completely naked save for a sword strapped across his chest. When questioned, he reportedly responded with a grin: "Clothes are for those who fear being seen." And people saw. Nobles, diplomats, servants, no one was spared the absurdity. During state visits, foreign envoys would arrive expecting royal decorum and be met with a half-dressed king challenging his courtiers to drinking games or reenacting military campaigns with kitchen utensils. One chronicler even described a meeting where the king offered political advice while hiccuping and applying ointment to a phantom wound he claimed was inflicted by the ghost of a jealous cook. The lines between politics and parody disappeared entirely. When disputes arose at court, they were sometimes settled not by arbitration, but by duels, sometimes mock, sometimes not, fought in dining halls with whatever objects were at hand: breadsticks, candlesticks, once, allegedly, a frozen trout. Royal decrees were issued in the early hours of the morning, often scribbled on scraps of parchment, signed with a wine-stained thumbprint, and delivered by hungover messengers who themselves weren't entirely sure what the orders meant. Romantically, Wenceslaus was no less unpredictable. His affections flitted from barmaids to noblewomen to laundresses with the same whimsical carelessness he applied to governance. Seduction wasn't whispered behind velvet curtains, it was shouted across rooms, sometimes with offers of land or livestock included. When one noble accused the king of compromising his sister, Wenceslaus laughed, handed him a jug of ale, and said, "Now we are family." The Holy Roman Empire, which had once recognized him as a central figure in European politics, eventually had enough. Diplomacy requires, at the very least, the appearance of stability, and Wenceslaus had long since exchanged that for drunken philosophizing and spontaneous nudity. They stripped him of his title of King of the Romans in a political maneuver thinly veiled as reorganization. In truth, it was a polite firing. Even his own brother, Sigismund, no stranger to scandal himself, referred to Wenceslaus as a man undressed, ungovernable, and usually unconscious. But despite the ridicule, the humiliations, and the parade of poor decisions, Wenceslaus continued to reign in Bohemia, not effectively, not respectfully, but consistently. His people tolerated him with the weary resignation one reserves for a loud uncle at a wedding, irritating, embarrassing, but somehow still part of the family. And yet, through the fog of ale and laughter, there remained something almost tragic. Wenceslaus was not a fool. He was educated, intelligent, capable, on paper. Somewhere beneath the jester's crown was a man who perhaps understood all too well the absurdity of power and chose to lean into it rather than pretend it meant something sacred, or perhaps he simply gave up trying. He died not on the battlefield or at the hand of an assassin, but in his bed, surrounded by the same comfort he'd always sought: distraction, indulgence, and escape. His kingdom survived him, just barely, and history recorded his name not with reverence, but with a smirk. Wenceslaus ruled as if the throne were a bar stool and the realm a tavern, and though the legacy he left was riddled with chaos, disorder, and empty wine bottles, it remains unforgettable, because sometimes a crown doesn't make a man greater. Sometimes it simply gives his flaws better lighting. In the grand palaces of Renaissance Europe, power didn't only move through armies or treaties. It slipped between silk sheets, whispered in bedchambers, and left entire dynasties shaken by the consequences of a kiss, a glance, or a betrayal disguised as affection. Few rulers personified this dangerous alchemy of passion and politics more vividly than Henry VIII of England and Francis III of France, two kings who wore desire like armor and wielded love as if it were a sword. For them, women were not simply companions. They were pawns, symbols, trophies, and sometimes warnings. The result: a trail of broken alliances, shattered trust, and kingdoms left reeling under the weight of their royal appetites. Henry VIII wasn't born a tyrant. He was, at first, the golden boy of the Tudor court, athletic, charismatic, educated. But beneath the polished surface pulsed a hunger, not only for power, but for legacy. And in Henry's world, legacy meant sons. He didn't just want heirs. He needed them, needed to outlast death, to leave behind not just a memory, but a dynasty carved in flesh. When his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to deliver a surviving male child, the king's obsession turned inward. He convinced himself that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. The solution? A new wife. And when the Pope refused to grant an annulment, Henry didn't compromise. He tore England away from the Catholic Church and built a new one around his personal needs. That decision, wrapped in theology, justified with scripture, wasn't just a political earthquake. It was a love letter with a national seal. Anne Boleyn, the woman at the center of this seismic shift, wasn't merely desired. She was exalted, pursued, mythologized. Henry sent her letters full of longing, gifts rich with symbolism, and promises he barely understood himself. When she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, the disappointment was swift. And when further pregnancies ended in tragedy, Henry's devotion dissolved. Anne was arrested on charges so fantastical they read more like a courtly revenge fantasy than legal accusation: adultery, witchcraft, conspiracy. She was executed in a public spectacle, and Henry, ever impatient, married again within days. Jane Seymour gave him the one thing he craved, a son, and died soon after. In a rare flicker of vulnerability, Henry mourned her, but only briefly. He had kingdoms to manage, enemies to confront, and beds to fill. Anne of Cleves followed, chosen from a portrait, and quickly dismissed when the reality didn't match the paint. Catherine Howard came next, a teenager drawn into a web of power and paranoia. Her affair, whether driven by fear, rebellion, or loneliness, was met with execution. Finally, Catherine Parr, wise enough to survive the storm by playing the game with steady hands and a quiet tongue. By the end of his reign, Henry had transformed from romantic to executioner, from poet to predator. His court, once a place of music and dancing, became a stage of fear. Each wife was a chapter, each beheading a punctuation mark in a grim narrative written by a man who mistook obsession for legacy. And though he left behind a male heir, it was his daughter Elizabeth, born of the wife he killed, who would outshine them all. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Francis I reigned with a different kind of fire. Where Henry's passion burned with desperation, Francis's sparkled with flair. He was the Renaissance king in every sense, cultured, elegant, fluent in poetry and flirtation alike. His court was a parade of art and affection, a swirling dance of color, perfume, and whispers. He welcomed Leonardo da Vinci to France, built palaces that glowed with ambition, and positioned himself as the ultimate patron of beauty, both aesthetic and personal. But beneath the velvet and verses lay a man no less entangled in his desires than his English counterpart. Francis treated his court like a private salon of temptation, surrounding himself with gentlewomen of the bedchamber, a title that blurred the line between servant, advisor, and paramour. Some were noblewomen of wit and power, others anonymous beauties who drifted through the palace like perfumes, intoxicating, temporary, unforgettable. His most famed mistress, Françoise de Foix, held his heart for a time. She was sharp-tongued, politically savvy, and unafraid to challenge the king. But as with all of Francis's affections, her place was never permanent. She was replaced, not by scandal or outrage, but simply because the king's attention moved on. His court wasn't just romantic, it was dangerous. Foreign dignitaries complained of alliances derailed by flirtations, ambassadors distracted by affairs, and political negotiations sabotaged by seductions. Francis made no apologies. He once declared that it was the duty of a French king to be an excellent lover, and while this might have charmed some, it terrified others. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once remarked that Francis was more dangerous in a bedroom than on a battlefield. Francis took it as a compliment. Unlike Henry, Francis didn't leave behind decapitated wives or national schisms, but he did leave behind a legacy just as chaotic. His wars were expensive, his diplomacy erratic, and his personal life so entangled with his politics that the two became indistinguishable. He ruled not with strategy, but with seduction. And in doing so, he created a France that dazzled from afar but trembled up close. Together, Henry and Francis painted a portrait of Renaissance kingship that was as glamorous as it was fragile. They lived surrounded by beauty and power, yet were haunted by the same shadow, the fear of being forgotten. They loved too many, trusted too few, and confused lust for loyalty. and while their monuments still stand, it's the human wreckage, wives discarded, alliances broken, kingdoms strained, that tells the deeper story. In the end, they weren't just rulers, they were men devoured by their own reflection, desperate to be remembered, terrified to be alone, and convinced that love, in the hands of a king, could be shaped like a sword. In the great halls of Castile, where marble echoed with footsteps and banners hung heavy with royal pride, there sat a queen no one looked at. Her crown was real, her titles official, but her presence, like a shadow trapped in daylight, was politely ignored. Maria of Portugal, wife of King Alfonso V, existed on paper, in ceremony, and in the strained smiles of diplomats, but not in the heart or even the bedchamber of her husband. Because while the realm called her queen, the king had already crowned someone else in silence and scandal. Leonor de Guzman, the mistress who ruled not from behind the throne, but from beside it, brazen and unashamed. Alfonso was not subtle. His affection for Leonor wasn't hidden in the folds of night or disguised as protocol. It was loud, lavish, and deliberate. Palaces were built for her. Lands were granted. Her children, 11 in total, were raised with titles and influence, while Maria's son, the legitimate heir, watched from the margins. Court painters were told to capture Leonor's likeness. Her name passed through noble mouths with equal parts awe and resentment. She was not royalty by birth or by law, but she had the king's attention, and in medieval Europe, that was sometimes all it took to wield power. Maria, by contrast, was everything a queen was expected to be: noble, dignified, and politically valuable. The daughter of the Portuguese king, she had been married to Alfonso in a match designed to unite two powerful kingdoms. But once the vows were spoken and the ink dried on diplomatic letters, her usefulness ended. At court, she was a presence without a voice, a symbol of alliance whose only real role was to remain seated, composed, and silent. When royal events unfolded, she was placed at the appropriate distance, close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. Leonor didn't simply fill the void left by Alfonso's absence, she dominated it. She negotiated treaties, hosted dignitaries, and made decisions with the confidence of a woman who knew no one would stop her. She didn't whisper behind veils. She smiled in broad daylight, walked through court corridors as if they belonged to her, and rewrote the rules of what it meant to be a royal consort. Those who disapproved found themselves removed. Those who dared to challenge her influence were silenced by proximity to the king's favor. And as Alfonso continued to publicly choose her again and again, the nobility learned to look past the queen and toward the mistress. But Maria was not without allies. She was, after all, a daughter of royalty, and her father, the King of Portugal, watched the slow humiliation of his daughter with growing fury. Treaties began to sour, border tensions flared, and though no war was declared, the threat hovered, a cloud heavy with implication. A king might ignore his wife, but her bloodline did not forget. Still, Alfonso refused to change, even as his health faltered and his advisors begged him to restore dignity to the throne. He remained tethered to Leonor. It took nothing less than a plague, the Black Death itself, to end the affair. When Alfonso fell ill in 1350, it was swift and final. He died, leaving behind not just a kingdom in flux, but two women whose lives had been bound together by years of rivalry, silence, and unspoken fury. And in death, Alfonso's decisions came due. Maria acted with a calm resolve, sharpened by years of humiliation. No longer a passive figure in a royal portrait, she took the reins with the precision of someone who had waited too long to be ignored any longer. Leonore, once untouchable, was arrested, stripped of protection, removed from the palaces she had treated as her own. Some say Maria hesitated, others say the opposite, that her orders were swift, direct, and cold. Either way, Leonore met her end not as a consort, but as a prisoner, and the woman once called Queen in Whispers vanished in chains. To the public, it was justice. To the court, it was a shift in power. But to Maria, it was something else entirely, a reckoning, a reminder that even in a world where crowns were handed to lovers and queens turned invisible, silence could be a weapon. That years of being overlooked do not erase anger, they store it. Alfonso X is remembered for his military victories and his consolidation of power. But behind those triumphs is the quieter, crueler story of two women, one raised to be a queen and forgotten, the other elevated by desire and destroyed. It is a story of how love, in the hands of a king, can make a woman vanish, and how vengeance, in the hands of the forgotten, can bring her back into the light. Beneath the solemn arches of the French court, virtue was carved into stone. Statues of saints lined the corridors, prayers echoed in chapels, and royal decrees praised chastity, loyalty, and divine order. But for all its piety, the palace of Philip IV, Philip the Fair, was built on contradiction. He ruled with a cold, imposing beauty that earned him his nickname. Yet his reign was less about moral clarity and more about carefully orchestrated control. And when the scandal known as the Tour de Nesle affair erupted, the illusion shattered. What followed wasn't justice. It was a performance, a brutal showcase of hypocrisy staged by a king who demanded virtue from women while treating morality like a flexible instrument for his own ends. It began with suspicion, born not from law or policy, but from a daughter's curiosity. Isabella of France, the very same woman who would later bring down her own husband, Edward II of England, noticed something strange. Her sisters-in-law, married to Philip's sons, were behaving oddly. Whispered conversations, secret gifts, missing jewels. Rumors spread of late-night visits to the Tour de Nesle, a shadowy tower on the Seine where guards were dismissed and privacy was absolute. And the visitors, two knights, brothers, well-placed at court, but now the subject of dangerously intimate gossip. Isabella, no stranger to political maneuvering, reported her suspicions to the king. What followed was not a quiet inquiry, but a thunderclap. Philip launched an investigation with the subtlety of a guillotine. The tower was searched, the knights were arrested, the princesses were interrogated, and very quickly, the scandal metastasized into a full-blown royal catastrophe. Under torture, the knights confessed. The princesses were found guilty of adultery. Their heads were shaved, their titles revoked, their names dragged through the mud. They were imprisoned for years, one in such poor conditions that she eventually faded into nothingness, forgotten even by those who once applauded her grace. The knights fared worse. Their confessions, extracted through agony, sealed their fate. They were publicly executed, tied, flayed, broken, not behind palace walls, but in the city square where the crowds could gather, gasp, and learn a lesson. When the king commands virtue, disobedience brings ruin. It was meant to be a statement of royal authority. Instead, it became a symbol of something much darker. Because while Philip punished his daughters-in-law with ferocity, whispers about his own affairs began to surface. In back rooms and candlelit halls, people spoke of the women hidden in the Louvre, discreetly escorted through private entrances, brought not for diplomacy but for entertainment. Some claimed the king maintained a private circle of women trained to charm visiting dignitaries, a kind of unspoken diplomatic ritual cloaked in silk and discretion. No official charges were ever brought, of course, no public confessions, because Philip wasn't judged by the same rules. He wore morality like armor in public and discarded it like a robe in private. He condemned passion when it disrupted his dynasty, but practiced indulgence with surgical detachment. And he used the language of virtue to justify brutality while refusing to hold a mirror to his own desires. The hypocrisy wasn't a secret, it was a system. Women at court were expected to be symbols of purity, embodiments of dynastic duty, their worth measured by obedience and fertility. Men, on the other hand, were allowed their shadows. Their indiscretions were passed off as power, their excesses as political necessity. Philip's treatment of the princesses was not about betrayal, it was about control. Their so-called infidelity wasn't an emotional affront. It was a challenge to the image he curated so carefully. A crack in the perfect painting, and cracks, if left unattended, could spread. So he crushed them. Not for what they did, but for daring to do it in a system that only allowed such freedoms for one gender, and especially not those married into the royal bloodline. And yet, the king himself remained untouched by scandal. His glare was law. His silence, strategy. While his sons' marriages crumbled and the royal family spiraled into mistrust and fear, Philip stayed still at the center, like a statue too cold to move and too dangerous to approach. He pursued religious reform, attacked the Knights Templar under the pretense of heresy, and seized their wealth with righteous fury, painting himself as a protector of faith. But behind this pious facade was a man deeply skilled in using virtue as a weapon, not a compass. The Tour de Nesle affair haunted the French court long after the prisons were emptied and the bodies buried. It revealed not just personal betrayal, but institutional rot. A system where women bore the weight of royal morality, and kings, divinely appointed, untouchable, bent virtue to suit their ambitions. The daughters-in-law of Philip the Faucet became cautionary tales, not of love gone wrong, but of justice performed for spectacle. Philip's legacy is often remembered in stone, cathedrals, treaties, coins bearing his sharp profile. But his reign carved something else into history, a lesson in the quiet violence of double standards, where the crown demands obedience, but exempts itself from the rules, where virtue is preached from marble thrones, but abandoned behind closed doors, and where the silence of a king can thunder louder than the screams of the condemned. Not all rulers conquered with armies. Some preferred whispers over war cries, silk over steel, and strategy made not at the council table, but in bedchambers behind locked doors. For Sigismund of Luxembourg, diplomacy was never limited to ink and seals. It was a dance of wits, smiles, and invitations that rarely needed to be written. As King of Hungary, King of the Romans, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor. Sigismund played his many roles like an actor with too many costumes, some of which he wore in secret while pretending to be someone else entirely. He was intelligent, multilingual, and masterfully composed in court. But behind that public image hid a man who preferred his messages delivered with perfume and lace. Sigismund viewed attraction not as a weakness, but as currency. His lovers, scattered across kingdoms and social classes, weren't just affairs, they were investments. Nobles' daughters, foreign aristocrats, traveling performers, he charmed them all with the same ease he used to convince bishops and dukes. And when seduction didn't open doors, he simply changed his outfit. On more than one occasion, Sigismund disguised himself as a traveling merchant and slipped into local towns just to observe, or more likely, to flirt. He relished the thrill of being unrecognized, except, of course, he wasn't. A tall man with regal posture, trailed by attendants who wore no disguise, his cover was paper thin, but no one challenged him. After all, who wants to confront the emperor when he's trying to buy apples while winking at your sister? At court, his mistresses were provided not only with comfort, but with power. They had their own rooms, their own servants, sometimes even their own chapels. Sigismund blurred the line between affection and governance. One of his lovers helped broker a minor peace agreement between two German factions. Another subtly persuaded her noble brother to lend his army to the emperor's campaign. These weren't women behind curtains. They were pieces on the board. To outsiders, it seemed scandalous. To Sigismund, it was efficient. He greeted every woman as an equal, one ambassador wrote, especially in private. That line, though meant as a clever observation, became a kind of quiet joke in European courts. Yet the emperor remained untouchable, because for all his romantic recklessness, Sigismund delivered results. He united fractured kingdoms, led military campaigns, and orchestrated the Council of Constance, a pivotal moment in church history. His reign proved that seduction could be just as effective as swords, and that loyalty, when inspired by love or lust, could be more durable than treaties. But where Sigismund used charm as a political instrument, Louis XV of France elevated it into a system. If Sigismund's court was a web of informal alliances bound by attraction, then Louis's was something far more deliberate, an institution of desire dressed in velvet and powdered with discretion. By the mid-18th century, Versailles had transformed into a palace not only of statecraft, but of selection. And deep within its labyrinths, nestled just outside its gilded core, was a quiet house with an elegant name, Parc aux Cerfs, the Deer Park. It was no park, and no deer lived there. The Deer Park was a private residence, maintained specifically to house young women selected for the king's pleasure. They were brought in discreetly, poor but beautiful, usually from unassuming families. They were educated, clothed, perfumed, and kept hidden until summoned. The recruitment was subtle but precise, orchestrated by trusted courtiers, and for a time, overseen with calm calculation by Madame de Pompadour. Pompadour herself had once been the king's mistress, but when her health waned and their physical relationship ended, she didn't vanish into history. She stayed, becoming his closest advisor, the orchestrator of entertainment, architecture, and diplomacy. She ran France in soft whispers, outmaneuvering ministers, with the same grace she once reserved for royal evenings. But she no longer shared his bed. That role, she understood, would be filled by others, so she helped manage it. While she handled politics and appearances, Parco Serves provided Louis with what he craved: newness, youth, silence. The girls were kept under the illusion of honor and elevation. Some received pensions, others land. A few were quietly married off once their time had passed. The process was smooth, practiced, and shockingly impersonal. The king rarely spoke of them. He simply rang the bell. Versailles began to feel less like a court and more like a performance stage built for a single man's indulgence. Ministers debated policy, while courtiers whispered about who had entered the deer park that week. It became common knowledge that the king's real interest lay not in governance, but in the quiet rotation of faces behind closed doors. Even ambassadors wrote about it, not as a scandal, but as a fact of French life. The turnover is brisk, one British envoy noted dryly. One might think the monarchy is auditioning itself. Ironically, Louis XV genuinely believed he was a good ruler. He held council meetings, received reports, signed papers. But the soul of the court, its energy, its attention, flowed elsewhere. To the rooms with silken walls, the coaches arriving at night, the faint perfume trails left in corridors. And through it all, Queen Marie Leschinska remained in place, like antique furniture, too dignified to discard, too forgotten to remember. She bore him 10 children and was rewarded with absence. The rot wasn't just moral, it was structural. Ministers were promoted not for ideas, but for keeping secrets. Policies were delayed so as not to disturb the king's evenings, and the nobility, watching the erosion of seriousness, began to mirror it. France glittered, but it dimmed underneath. What Sigismund hinted at with charm, Louis systematized with architecture. What began as flirtation became governance through desire. The bedroom became the throne room. Love, or something like it, became national strategy. And in that transformation, the mask slipped. These kings, so powerful, so adored, weren't driven by destiny or divine right. They were driven by absence, a hollow need for validation, for permanence, for something that could not be conquered by force or inherited through blood. They loved not too much, but too often and too easily. Not because they were generous, but because they were afraid to be alone with themselves. History would remember their titles, their wars, their buildings. But behind those facades, one truth whispered louder than any trumpet. They ruled vast kingdoms, yet struggled to govern their own hunger. There are kings who rule with might, others with cunning. And then there are those who never truly ruled at all, men born into crowns they were never built to carry, stumbling through history like characters in a tragedy rewritten as farce. Christian VII of Denmark was one of those kings. From the moment he ascended the throne, it was clear that the real question wasn't how he would govern, but if he ever could. Christian suffered from what we would now recognize as schizophrenia, though in his time it was labeled simply as madness. His mind twisted reality like a child kneading soft wax, bending the world into absurdity. He spoke to his own hand, wandered halls chasing imaginary enemies, and during official banquets would suddenly vanish, only to be found galloping down marble corridors on an invisible horse. The court watched in horrified silence. Ministers gave speeches to an empty-eyed monarch who stared into space or burst into laughter without cause. And yet, the machinery of monarchy kept moving. His queen, Caroline Matilda, a British princess, had arrived expecting stability, perhaps even respect. What she got was a husband who treated cutlery as weapons in hallway chases, and once tried to knight a puppet he found amusing. Alone, neglected, and surrounded by nobles more interested in containment than compassion, Caroline sought refuge. She found it in the king's personal physician. Johann Friedrich Struensee was everything Christian was not: calm, rational, ambitious. He didn't just soothe the king's moods, he quietly began to run the country. Laws, reforms, decrees, they all bore Struensee's touch. While Christian played with toys and muttered about conspiracies, Denmark modernized behind his back, and behind another door, something even more delicate unfolded. The queen and the doctor fell in love. It was one of the strangest love triangles in history. A monarch too lost to notice, a queen too lonely to care, and a doctor too powerful to stop. They had a child together, one the court accepted with forced smiles, while Struensee continued to pull the strings, effectively transforming Denmark into a constitutional laboratory with royal marionettes. But courts are never truly blind. Whispers grew. Jealousy stirred, and eventually the inevitable happened. Christian's stepmother, sensing an opportunity, staged a coup. Struensee was arrested and brutally executed, his body displayed as a warning. Caroline was exiled, her letters intercepted, her name tarnished. And Christian? He returned to the only place he ever seemed at home, a palace filled with caretakers, puppets, and silence. He lived on, king in name, but sovereign of nothing. Denmark moved forward without him, and history, with its brutal irony, remembered him not for what he did, but for what others did in his name. But Christian was not the only monarch whose rule dissolved into absurdity. Across the Channel, Charles II of England turned his court into a carnival. After years of exile and civil war, he returned to power with a single mission: restore joy, preferably in large quantities and with minimal clothing. Theaters reopened, dancing resumed. The Puritan age was buried beneath powdered wigs, silk stockings, and an endless rotation of mistresses. Charles didn't pretend to be a moral leader. He openly paraded his favorites at court events, built private corridors so they could reach his bedroom discreetly, and fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, all of whom were given titles and estates. His long-suffering wife, Queen Catherine, watched it all with quiet dignity, sipping from what was likely a very well-used flask of Portuguese wine. And yet, the people loved him. He was the merry monarch, the king who made monarchy feel like a party you didn't want to end. He joked on his deathbed, asking his brother not to let poor Nell Gwyn, the most famous of his mistresses, starve. It was charming, it was human, and it was deeply unserious. Charles ruled a recovering nation like a man trying to distract it from its trauma. And for a while, it worked. But some courts took their darkness further. Erik the XIV of Sweden started his reign with brilliance. He was tall, artistic, fascinated by astronomy. But as the years went on, that brilliance blurred into something far more dangerous. He began to suspect everyone, nobles, advisors, as servants. He believed the stars were speaking against him, that plots surrounded him at every turn. And so, he struck first. In one of the most infamous episodes of his rule, the Sture murders, Eric invited several nobles to dinner. What began as a feast ended with the king drawing a knife and stabbing one of them to death mid-conversation. Blood splashed across the tapestries, the courtiers froze, and Eric, breathing heavily, turned to them as if nothing had happened. His crown no longer shielded him. It revealed him. The king had become his own executioner. His descent accelerated. He dressed in disguises and spied on his own council, shouted at invisible enemies, and wandered the palace halls composing erratic love poetry. Eventually, his own brother intervened. Eric was imprisoned, quietly removed, and died years later, muttering about betrayal and eclipses. But if Eric was madness turned violent, Ferdinand I of Naples was something else entirely, rational, intelligent, and terrifying. He ruled well, efficiently, decisively. He kept order, crushed revolts, balanced books. But beneath the castle, in the private chambers of his estate, he curated something no history book can fully explain: the Black Room. After defeating his enemies, Ferdinand didn't exile them. He didn't simply execute them. He preserved them, literally. He had them embalmed, dressed, and mounted like hunting trophies. Dozens of bodies, perfectly posed, each accompanied by a plaque stating their name and offense. And when foreign dignitaries visited, he gave them tours. Imagine it: a candlelit corridor beneath a royal palace, filled with the lifeless faces of those who once dared to oppose him. One guest fainted, another vomited. Ferdinand smiled and explained each corpse with the care of a museum curator. This was not horror for horror's sake. It was policy, a visual argument, a message carved in flesh. Loyalty is not optional. In the end, all these kings, Christian, Charles, Eric, Ferdinand, offer a final truth. Power without restraint doesn't just corrupt, it mutates. It wraps itself in velvet and madness, perfume and silence. It throws parties while whispering threats. It smiles while collecting enemies beneath the floorboards. Monarchy, at its most fragile, is a mirror. Sometimes it reflects wisdom, sometimes chaos, and sometimes it shows us what happens when absolute authority meets the unchecked hunger of the human soul. A king may begin as a man, but if no one says no, he does not remain one for long.